Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Cedric Geffen. I'm the president of March of the Living Australia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to what I'm sure will be another riveting presentation in this March of the Living Australia's 16th online event this year. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we work and live, and on which this online event is being hosted today. We pay our respects to Indigenous leaders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. History, tradition, heritage, culture, and identity are central themes that form the backbone of what March of the Living strives to educate and inform about, and the dual focus of the program on our ancient, ages-old culture and history, coupled with the sometimes tragic events of our more recent past, and the joyous and even miraculous achievements of the present and future of our people, is what makes March of the Living so special, and in many ways, so unique. We pride ourselves on the quality of our educators and guides, and tonight we have the pleasure of being guided by one of the many such amazing educators. Assaf Boker is an accomplished tour guide in Israel who has worked with March of the Living groups, predominantly from the USA, for a number of years, and he will share with us some amazing insights into the traditions related to Sukkot, the holiday we have just celebrated, where hundreds of thousands of our ancestors have ascended to Jerusalem to celebrate the holiday and to feel part of the Jewish collective. Assaf will take us on an eye-opening virtual tour to the Southern Wall Excavations, and we will learn together how some of our Jewish rituals were shaped in this very place. We tried desperately to get Assaf to join us for this presentation. However, due to other commitments, he was unable to do so at this particular time. And therefore, we will rely this evening on the recording of the presentation he gave for International March of the Living in the US only a few days ago on Chol HaMoed, at a very uncomfortable hour for this audience due to the time differences involved. The subject matter, nevertheless, is fascinating. Assaf's knowledge and insights are breathtaking. So despite the change in format and the lack of an opportunity to engage directly with Assaf at the end of the session, I hope that this event will live up to the hype and expectations we have created. But please feel free to add comments on the chat. And if there are any questions you would like answered, please send them in and we will gladly forward them to Assaf, and we will respond to you via email after the event. So now all that remains is for you to sit back and enjoy. Thank you.
And it's such an honor to be here with all of you this evening here in Israel, or this morning in the US, or wherever you are. It's the March of the Living has a real important role in my development as a tour guide. And when Moniz approached me and leading this virtual tour, I was really honored to take part. So thank you all for being here. And beyond the long introduction, so quite simply, my name is Assaf. I'm 33 years old. I live in Tel Aviv. I never intended to be a tour guide. My dad is a diplomat, as you heard. My mom is a doctor. And when I told him one day I want to become a tour guide, my Jewish mother looked at me like, "Are you sure you want to become a tour guide?" Finally, after convincing her, I found a profession that I truly love. And for the past 5 years, I had the chance to lead the full spectrum of anyone you can imagine through this land. And the last 2 years have been obviously difficult because I was not only robbed of my profession, I was robbed of my passion. So you being here tonight gives me a chance to practice my passion and tell people the stories that I love to share so much. So in advance, thank you for being here. And now let's get to the tour itself. Now we're going to start off not by staring at this floor, as interesting as it is. I wanted to build up and create a wow effect as we look at Jerusalem together. So as the screen opens up to you, I want to welcome you to Jerusalem. And we're now standing on the top of the Mount of Olives. And I know the topic of today's tour is the Davidson Center, the Southern Wall Excavations. But I thought that the proper introduction can't start there. if we want to understand Jerusalem, if we want to better understand the Jewish rituals involving one of the three pilgrimage holidays, Sukkot, that we're currently celebrating, we need to zoom out first and take a look at Jerusalem as a whole. And I want to introduce a miracle that a lot of times when people come to Jerusalem for the first time, they miss, because they come here from their own very individual perspective, looking for things that would touch their hearts as a Jew, as a Christian, as a Muslim, and often they don't see the full scope that Jerusalem has to offer. So as we're standing here, let's take a look at what it is that we're looking at. Within the reach of a finger, where we're standing, we're able to see, and if you would be here physically, to walk no longer than 30 minutes to the three most holy sites for the three Abrahamic religions. The golden dome that you're currently looking at is Mount Moriah. According to Jewish tradition, this Mount Moriah is where the binding of Isaac took place. On this very mountain, this is where the first temple was built. This is where the second temple was built. This is where the first Jewish capital was established. Hence the importance of Jerusalem for the Jewish people. But if you just move your screen slightly to the left and you encounter those two gray domes, you're looking at the site which is the most sacred site for 2 billion Christians around the world. It's quite a miracle that the two sites are so close in proximity. For the majority of the Christian world, the importance of Jerusalem, the importance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is this is the site where Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected all under one roof. This is the source of importance from a Christian perspective. And finally, for the Muslim perspective, when you look at this golden dome over here, the same dome that a second ago I told you, Mount Moriah, binding of Isaac, first temple, second temple, according to the Muslim narrative, this dome is where Muhammad ascended to the heavens on a magical ladder as he encountered previous prophets until he reached Allah himself, who gave him one of the 5 pillars of Islam, the pillar of prayer. And as a result of that, the importance of Jerusalem from a Muslim perspective is this is the origin of the Muslim prayer, of the 5 prayers a day over here. So once we understood in a modern context the importance of Jerusalem, I think we are ready to start an understanding the layers of the city from a chronological level. We started off speaking about this golden dome. This is where the binding of Isaac takes place. Abraham brings his son, the son he loves, Isaac, and sacrifices him almost to God. Later on, his son Isaac will have his son Jacob, and their children will settle in this land. Now, if you take a look at the sky, the day that the photo was taken, they were actually a little gray. But this land suffers on yearly basis, on every couple of years, I'm trying to say, from droughts, up until this day, by the way. Today, we have modern technology that allows us to overcome those droughts. But in the age where this technology did not exist, when a drought was upon this land, people left this land, they immigrated. Now, when you're a Jew living in this part of the world, or anyone living in this part of the world, when you want to immigrate, searching for water, you have 2 options, the east or the west. On the east, you have the Euphrates River. On the west, you have the Nile, Egypt. The Jews immigrate to Egypt, and they settle there for 400 years. And after they settle there for 400 years, an interesting parallel we have here is with the presence of the Aphido people. Aphido is a group of people living in Egypt, more or less parallel to the same time of the Exodus. Can you hear the similarity between the word Aphido and Ivri, Hebrew? Perhaps there is a similarity then. But the Jews are taken out of Egypt and they're reintroduced to the land. And they live over here in the form of 12 different tribes. And over here, you have a map showing that. Now, this is, of course, the era of the judges, right? The conquest of Joshua. What does it mean, this era of the judges? Judges are not kings. They're charismatic leaders that rise to the occasion, lead the people for a given period of time, and after they pass away, you have a vacuum period. Now try to imagine the 12 tribes living over here, surrounded by nations that have kings, getting them ready for war. At some point, those 12 tribes will demand a king like the pagans around them have. Now, of course, the answer is, well, you already have a king, God himself, but the Jews insist. And the first king that the Jews will get is not King David, as often people mistake, but King Saul. King Saul has a short episode of kingdomship ruling over the nation, over the 12 tribes, but he's followed by King David. King David understands something very fundamental. It will be impossible to unite all 12 tribes without a common cause. And he decides to conquer the city right here behind him, called Jebusite. He conquers the city, renames it Jerusalem, and makes it his capital. His son will take this to the next level, not only having one central capital city, but also having a center of worship. Where is that center of worship going to be? On the same mountain where the binding of Isaac took place, because of its divine purpose in Jewish history. What you're looking at now is a drawn diagram of the city of David. At the top, today we have there the Golden Dome. On the top, this is where King Solomon will build his temple. Let's give us some geographical references to what it is we're talking about in today. If you look at the Golden Dome over here, this is the peak of the city of David you saw a second ago. And if we start moving our screen to the left towards the Kidron Valley, you can see how the city of David started more or less where you see this building over here, all right, stretching all the way until the Golden Dome that you see here. This is the city of David. So we've went over some history, leading us to the first temple built by King Solomon. So king number 3, King Solomon, building the first temple. But now, friends, with your permission, I want to actually zoom out and try to understand the land of Israel in the geopolitical context. And in order to do this, I've already prepared a map for you. And this map is perhaps one of the most important things we would learn in today's virtual tour. The land of Israel is historically trapped between powers coming from the east is over here, sorry, mirror imaging when you look at the camera, right? East and the west. And it's always trapped between empires coming from both of those directions. Now, when I gave you and spoke about the kingdom, that is a rare episode in history when both empires are relatively weak, both in the east and the west, allowing a local kingdom to be established. I'll throw here a fun fact, and because I can't see your faces because we're in a webinar, so I would usually ask, how many times was the land of Israel a sovereign, independent entity? And then I have all of the Israel experts throwing numbers. 2, 7, 9. How many times in history the land of Israel was independent entity? The answer is 4 times. All right. Oh, I gave the answer already too early, friends. I'm sorry. First time, time of King David. Second time, time of the Maccabees. Third time, time of the Crusaders. Not Jewish sovereignty, but a Christian kingdom. Fourth time, modern day state of Israel. What am I trying to emphasize here? That usually empires either in the east and the west are relatively strong, and therefore the ability of the land here to be independent is not really in existence. Now let's start talking about those empires. In the year 586, we have a power rising in the east called the Babylonian Empire, swipes moving west, destroys the kingdom of Judea, and destroys the first temple. All right, so the first temple we discussed earlier is no longer in place. But empires have a tendency to fall and rise. And when one empire falls, a new empire rises. And the empire that takes over is the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. Now, every empire has their own philosophy of how to govern this huge given piece of land. And if the Babylonians are all about destroy and conquer, the Persians are actually relatively tolerant religiously. allowing all the nations to rebuild their temples and worship their own gods as long as they're taxed by the central government. So relative tolerance. But the Persian Empire will fall and a new empire will rise, and this time it will be an empire coming from the west, the the Greek Empire, led by Alexander the Great. And their motto is a whole new one. The motto is Hellenization. Let's try and create a culture so advanced and so sophisticated, people's hearts would be drawn to that culture naturally. This works for the majority of the empire, but the Jews are not willing to adopt a foreign culture and they revolt. We'll celebrate that in 3 months' time in the story of Hanukkah. And the Greek Empire falls, and the Jewish kingdom of the Maccabees survives until a new empire rises. And this brings us to our topic today, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire practices the same Hellenization mechanism like the Greeks, but with one new twist. They appoint here a client king. And the name of this client king is King Herod. And King Herod is a megalomaniac king who creates countless building projects. But the most well-known of all of his projects is the temple in Jerusalem. And this is going to be the focus of our tour. Jews have made pilgrimage to the temples way before the time of King Herod. It was part of the Jewish law that in the 3 pilgrimage holidays, Sukkot, Passover, Shavuot, Jews came to the temple to offer their sacrifices. But something happened at the era of King Herod. King Herod is devoted to put the land of Israel on the map. And as a result of that, he embarks in some of the craziest building projects that this land has ever seen, including rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. How does he go around building it? When you look at Mount Moriah in our original photo, and for this I will use my hands, Mount Moriah is a relatively small mountain, and therefore the temple, as a result of the geography, is relatively small. King Herod decides to build here the largest temple that the Roman world has ever seen. And the way he does it, he takes the round mountain and surrounds it with 4 massive retaining walls. Right now, you're looking at the eastern wall. That's a 2,000 wall right here behind me. He builds one on the west, on the north, on the south, creating a 14 football field square plaza on which he builds his temple on. Roman sources tell us that there are 3 miracles that exist in the land of Israel. Number 1, it's the Dead Sea where everything floats. Number 2, it's the day of the Sabbath that no one works. Number 3, it's this magnificent temple in Jerusalem, that it was a real world trademark at his time that does not have a single statue. What we're going to do now, we're going to discuss the Jewish experience as you come to experience the temple for the first time. Now, I want you to take a very good look at the street over here. As you can see, the street is parallel to the western retaining wall built by King Herod. So this is what it looked like 2,000 years ago. But right now, I'm going to take you to that street, what it looks like today. All right, it's the exact same wall, exact same street. Now, the thing we need to keep in mind, is that most of the Jewish population living in the land of Israel was living in relatively rural communities, small villages of several hundred people, maybe 1,000, 2,000, but the majority of the population was living in the rural communities. Everyone knew about the temple in Jerusalem. It was a must to come here, if not 3 times a year, at least once a year. And try to imagine yourself growing up in your small shtetl, your small Jewish town, and you hear from the kids who are a grade or 2 older than you about the first time that they came into the temple in Jerusalem, and you're eager with expectation. When will it be my time to arrive to the temple in Jerusalem? And the holiday of Sukkot has arrived, right? And the buildup is building up in your stomach, and you join your 2 parents on a pilgrimage, aliyah l'regel, and you walk for a week or for even 2 weeks, depending where you are in the land, And every night you sit with your dad around the campfire and he tells you, son, everything you think you know about beauty, about power, about the power of the Jewish people will change once you arrive to Jerusalem. And finally, you are here. And when King Herod built this place, friends, he really thought of every single detail. Walking on the street as a young teenager 2,000 years ago, if you ask me, could be parallel to the experience of someone from a small village in, let's say, Ethiopia, being put in the middle of Times Square, New York. Why am I using this example? Because this building over here is a skyscraper. And when you look over here at those building stones, this is something that the ordinary Jew living here did not encounter. Most of the villages were built from unmasoned stones. The richer ones did have masoned stones, but not to this quality. So this creates a wow factor as you arrive over here, right? You can't ignore the wow when you're walking in Jerusalem in those streets. And right now, I want us to talk a little bit about what do you need to do as you're arriving to the temple. And in order to do this, I need you to try and imagine yourself surrounded by 3 metaphorical circles, okay? Can't really see them, they're metaphorical, but they represent the status in which you're in. Finally, you arrive to Jerusalem. And the first thing you need to do is you need to change your currency. Every day, you're using the local Roman currency. Remember, we're living under Roman law. But over here in Jerusalem, you have your own unique currency. You're going to give your donation to the temple with, the half shekel coin. Why do you need to use a different currency? One will say it's a sign of independence. If I have the ability to coin my own coins or to use my own coins, then I have a state of sovereignty. Others will say it's a way for you to express how this place is different from the rest, trying to separate Chol from Kodesh. But you would walk over here to the money changer in this shop, and you would give in your Roman currency, and in return, you would buy a half shekel coin. Now, over here, you see a half shekel coin. The coins themselves were not actually coined in Jerusalem. They were coined in Tyre. And the reason Tyre was picked for that purpose is because the quality of the coins that came from that region that had something close to 95% pure silver. Now, you can see the similarity to the modern day Israeli shekel coin is quite shocking, but it's not by coincidence, as you can imagine. The whole idea of the state of Israel is to restore Jewish presence in this part of the world. And those ancient coins that we find here are a testimony of Jewish life here that we are trying to recreate in our daily lives here in Israel. Now, do you remember a second ago we spoke about the circles? So why did I call this the outside circle? Because the money is something exterior. We don't touch it physically, right? I know a lot of people who love money. I don't know someone who's connected to one specific $100 bill. Something almost exterior from our body. But it's the first thing we need to change as we're about to make our entrance to the temple. Change your currency from the local currency to the Jerusalem temple half shekel coin currency. And after this, we're going to move into the closer circle. What do we have in the closer circle? This is where you buy your sacrifice. What is the Hebrew word for sacrifice? And some of you, I assume you already know the word, korban. And the root of the word comes from the origin shoresh, to karev, to get closer. Your korban, your sacrifice, is means for you to get closer to God. Now, one may ask me the following question, and it's a valid question. If you know basic economy, you know that why do I need to buy my sacrifice in Jerusalem? If we have here, and the numbers are around 300,000 Jewish pilgrims during Sukkot. Sukkot is the holiday with the most pilgrims who are coming to Jerusalem, partly because also of the weather being the most convenient at this time of the year. So why can't we bring it from our small village back home? And the answer is that a sacrifice needs to be an animal in mint perfect condition. It cannot have a single broken bone. And therefore, in most likelihood, you would buy your sacrifice over here. And why do I call this the second circle? Because an animal is not currency. You're holding it close to your body, right? You're holding the animal close after it was purchased in order for it to avoid it from running away. But during that time, because you're holding it so close, you're constantly reminding yourself of what it is that you're about to do. You're not about to do an ordinary thing. You're about to make your ascension to the temple, and this will remind you of that purpose. Over here, now you know what, we'll go one more step, and now I'll show you a very interesting lens than everything we spoke about. So we've already spoken about the currency, changing the money. Then we spoke about purchasing the sacrifice. A kosher animal, the sacrificial laws were long and complicated, and depending at what stage you are in your life cycle, this determined what kind of sacrifice you had to buy, also your level of wealth, of course. And now we need to change your physical status from impure to pure. How does one go to do this? By fully immersing yourself in the Jewish ritual bath called a mikveh. I'll start off by saying something that may surprise a lot of people. Mikvehs in Jewish tradition are no older than 2,200 years, right? We have not found in archaeology a single mikveh which is older than 2,200, maybe 2,300, maybe, but I wouldn't even gamble on that. We haven't found mikvehs that are older than that. What is the origin of a mikveh? In the book of Leviticus, there are certain conditions that God orders the people of Israel to purify themselves in what is known as mayim chaim, living water. Now, in the book of Leviticus, there isn't a clear definition on what living water means. This is where the oral Torah comes in and tries to bridge the gap as to how does one know what living water means. And the common interpretation was living water, mayim chaim, is water that got into its site without any human intervention, any human assistance. So for example, if you see a mikveh, the water there has to be bought on a natural manner. So one method is a treasure. A treasure is a water storage, which is connected by a canal to the mikveh. And the water storage stores rainwater. Can we all agree that when rainwater gets to a place naturally, there's no human intervention? And then you can fill up the mikveh water itself with water brought from the spring of Jerusalem, the Gihon spring. Now, obviously, if you're bringing the water from the Gihon spring yourself, that's not living water. But you have the treasure, remember? In a process called paralleling, you lift up the dam, one drop of water of the living water touching the water over here concludes all the water to be mayim chaim. The name of this process is hashakah. Paralleling, I've oversimplified it. I know if there are mikveh experts in the crowd, my apologies. It's just for the sake of time. But this is how a mikveh works. Why do we start seeing mikvehs only 2,200 years ago and not earlier? Because earlier than that, perhaps most Jews lived in places where they had sources of living water naturally. Spring, a river, maybe a sea, right? And therefore, there was no need to build a mikveh. But when we're looking at the Roman era and the Greek era, but especially the Roman era, and we're seeing a trend of urbanization, where Jerusalem itself grows to a community with 100,000 people there. And in Sukkot, or one of the other pilgrimage holidays, we're talking about a population of 300,000 people. You need to find a solution, guys. Like, where are all these people going to purify themselves? This is when we start to discover mikvehs in archaeology. A mikveh has 40 se'ah of water. Se'ah is an ancient measurement. And the translation in today's liters is either 473 or 700 liters, depending which measurement you're using. But the number 40 is not by coincidence. 40 is a very interesting number in Jewish tradition. How many years were the Jews in the desert? 40 years. How many days was Noah in his ark? 40 days. How many weeks of pregnancy before giving birth? Most cases, 40 weeks. So the number 40 exemplifies in Jewish tradition something starting again. And in the mikveh, that's exactly what happens. The people arriving, the pilgrims, like yourselves, like me, would walk over here. This mikveh is a communal mikveh because you can see the wall in the middle of the stairs. They would walk down one stairway, completely naked, fully immerse themselves in the water, say the blessing, and they would come pure on the other side. Once they come on the other side, they're careful not to touch any impure object. And from here, carefully, they would proceed to the temple itself. Now, I told you I'll give you a very interesting twist about the things I've covered before. Because even though this is a tour aimed from a Jewish audience, we can't ignore something very interesting from a Christian perspective. Do you remember, or in common culture, you have come across Jesus turning over the tables of the money changers? Where does this happen? Most likely right here. Why? Because Jesus is a Jew that tries to live to the highest ideals of his time that he thinks are the correct ideals. And he's deeply disappointed to see all the hustle, bustle, and the merchants and the yelling. And he gets so frustrated, he would walk here to one of the tables of the money changers and flip the table of the money changers. Another thing exactly on this topic, just try and think about it. That when we read in the Gospels about the crucifixion, it says that Jesus was crucified without a broken bone in his body. Why? Because the writers of the Gospels are Jews who are writing for a Jewish audience. Jewish audience know very, very well that a sacrifice needs to be in mint perfect condition without a single broken bone. That's why the Jewish pilgrims brought their sacrifices over here. So for the Christian writers, they're showing them we're fulfilling the Jewish prophecy, we're following the laws of the sacrifices. And of course, the idea of the immersion in water is what in Christianity later on developed to baptism. This was just opening brackets because I think you can't do a tour here without trying to give the 360 view. But before we proceed to the stairs of the temple, I want to steal 2 more minutes of our time together. And I want you to look at this artifact over here, where the people are standing. If we open the Talmud and we read, we see that there is a special corner of the Temple Mount that gets a special honor. It's the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount. And according to the Talmud, it is in this corner that every Friday, one of the members of the clergy will climb all the way up to the top and will blow the shofar or the trumpet to announce that the day of the Sabbath is coming. Over here, I pause and ask people, who do you think this guy is? And they usually tell me, oh, that must be the high priest himself. And I tell them, all right, obviously you've never served in the army. And sorry, I got here something in the chat that it's hard for me to ignore. I'll come back to this question. It's a good one. So Ariana, when we're doing the questions, please just remind me of this one. But I want to share with you this corner over here. All right, so when you're standing over here on this corner, this is where the shofar would have been blown. And it could have been heard perhaps in the entire city that we see in front of us. And when I ask people, who was it? They're telling me, oh, it must have been the high priest. And I tell them, no. Standing here so far above the ground, no one can recognize your face. Not only that, to carry the shofar all the way up to the top here, it's kind of an ungrateful job. So most likely the person who did it, I don't know this for a fact, but it was the rookie. Right now, I can imagine his frustration. Climbing there, and he's like, man, not getting any recognition, carrying this big shofar. He's like, I want to be recognized. I want to get recognition for what it is that he's doing. So what does he decide to do? He decides to draw graffiti on this corner. I can identify with this. When I was in the army, don't tell anyone, I used to write graffiti in deserted guard spots around Gaza or Lebanon. I used to write Assaf Boker, which was my name, November 06 draft, or how much more. This is what I used to write everywhere. And this priest did the same. He left us a piece of ancient graffiti on this corner And when the temple was destroyed, this stone was knocked down to the ground, and his graffiti was waiting here with us. And before you all go ahead and read what it says here, how do I know it's graffiti? Take a look at the letters. They look like childlike letters. When we look at the finished standards that King Herod maintains for building the temple, with every single stone having this fine frame around it, do you think he would allow those sloppy, childish letters? This is someone's private initiative. And what does it say over here? Lebeit, to the house, hateki'ah, of trumpeting, leha, to, and then it's broken. Most likely it says to announce. Now I want to pause here and just make sure we're all on the same page, realizing what we just did together. We took a text 2,000 years old and we were able to read it together. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't another culture, civilization, nation, or people that can read texts that came out of the ground 2,000 years ago at the same ease that they read the newspaper every morning. When we talk about Zionism, when we talk about the Jewish right over this land, not exclusive if you ask some, if you ask me, but there is a very strong Jewish historical connection to this land. How can it be denied when we are able to read the things that come out of the ground? And this is something that I think should always be in the back of your minds. The connection, your connection, the ability to read texts that were written 2,000 years ago. Now, my time is running a little short, so I'm going to proceed to those stairs. And to many people, those stairs are the most touching part in every tour on the Davidson Center. Before we go into the stairs themselves, I actually want to show you what these stairs looked like 2,000 years ago in order to give you a better perspective. So as you're looking over here, let's load them as we can look at the stairs. These are the stairs. And we refer to these stairs as the Southern Steps because they are part of the Southern Wall. Now, when we start thinking about the pilgrimage, try and think what we did up until this point. We spoke about Jews that are coming from different places, different corners of the world. Not all of them came from here. Some came from Alexandria, from Babylon, from North Africa. They spoke different languages, all right? But they're coming here and they do the exact same rituals. They go in and they buy the half shekel coin. And they go in and they buy the sacrifice. And later on, they come in and they go to the mikveh together. This creates a feeling of peoplehood. But this feeling of peoplehood is actually boosted when they arrive at these steps. When they arrive at these steps, they start to read together Psalms that were written by King David. And those Psalms are part of the Psalms we read every Friday night when we do the blessing over the food, Shir LaMa'alot. Asai na yelarim, and I should look up to the mountains. Where does my aid come from? Me'ayin ba ezri. Ezri me'im Hashem. My aid comes from the Lord, Yotzer Shamayim va'aretz, the creator of the heavens and the earth. When you stand here, these Psalms get a geographical meaning they can't get anywhere else in the world. You're looking at the hills. You have in the back of your mind the pilgrimage you did, walking for a week, for 2 weeks over here. You understand the challenge. And finally, you see the house of the Lord in front of you. Now, the stairs themselves are designed in a very specific way. One short stair, one long stair. And the idea here is that you will pace yourself as you're entering the house of the Lord. Now, I do want to highlight several last things, and then I will open it up for your comments, for your questions, because I've spoken for more than enough time. Over here, when I bring groups, I share with them the following statement. You are now walking in the only place in the land of Israel that you can be certain, or the closest you can be to certain, that your ancestors walked on. And I would highlight walked on at this time of the year in Sukkot. And people ask me, how do I know that? I'm Ashkenazi, I'm Sephardic. How do you know I was like, whoa, relax. Doesn't matter if you're Ashkenazi or Sephardic or any other Jewish denomination. It doesn't matter for this purpose. If you're a Jew, you originate from Judea. Jews had to come to the temple 3 times a year. Sukkot was the pilgrimage holiday that had the most pilgrims. 3 times a year, that was the command. Let's say your ancestor was a sloppy. They came only once a year. Let's say they came only once in a lifetime. But if they came, they had to come here and they had to walk these stairs. If you're a Kohen or a Levi, that may be false because they had a separate entrance, although they could have used this, but this is where they walked on. And this is the source of significance of these stairs. You're walking where your ancestors walked in a very, very high certainty. So the idea here is you are connecting to your past. Now, if you look over here, do you see the 3 blocked arches over here? 1, 2, and 3. Those are the exit gates. I will show you what they looked like 2,000 years ago. It will give you slightly a better idea. You can see here, those gates are the entrance gates. And over here, the 2 are the end. Sorry, over there, they're the exit. Over here, this is the entrance. The 2 is for the entrance. Now, if you were in a time of mourning and you lost someone you love, you did not enter from the entrance. You would rather enter from the exit. Why would you enter from the exit? Because as you're walking, remember, most Jews came from small towns, right? No more than several hundred, maybe 1,000 people at most. You're walking and you see more people than you've ever seen in your life. And they see you walking the opposite way, and no one is rude and pushing you, but rather they see you're entering from the entrance, from the exit, and they turn to you and you say, Hamakom yivarecha v'Hashem yenachamecha. The place will cite you, and God Himself will comfort you. You hear this once and twice and 3 times. By the time you're done with the tunnel and enter the temple, you may have heard the blessing from over 50 complete strangers. This is the feeling of peoplehood. The power of the temple is not just the house of the Lord. The power of the temple is the feeling of a collective identity it created amongst the Jewish people in those 3 pilgrimage holidays. And when we think of the role of the temple through this lens, I think we better understand what was lost when in the year 70, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans. And after the temple was destroyed by the Romans, the leaders of the Jewish people needed to find new ways to unite the people without the temple. Not only the house of the Lord was lost, but also the sense of peoplehood. And one of the methods used is the feeling of mourning of the lost temple. And 500 years ago, give or take, the Western Wall has become a site of Jewish worship, a site where Jews from all around the world come together to commemorate and remember the lost temple, and today also celebrate the regained sovereignty of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And I would like to conclude, as we're looking here at the Western Wall, at the Kotel, every March of the Living groups comes here when they come from Poland to Israel on Independence Day as part of the March of the Living. And I want to say to all of you, thank you. And God willing, B'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And truly, I hope to see you here next year in Jerusalem. So I will pause here. Very happy to take any comments, any questions. Thank you for being here and for being with us up until this point.
Thank you so much, Assaf, for giving us this wonderful lecture and the ability to sort of visit Israel from afar. We did have a few questions that come in that I'll now address, if you can just answer them briefly. There was a few sort of technical questions about the turn of events that happened. So one, somebody had asked about the location of the table flipping that you were speaking about. Could you address that?
Sure. So I think I did manage to read a line or two in that specific question, not the full thing, but I will explain. In the Christian texts, in the Gospels, it says that Jesus entered the temple and he started to flip the tables of the money changers. Now, there is a question when we're reading in the Gospels, what does it mean, the temple courts? Does the temple mean only what we have up there as part of the temple courts, or also the perimeters around the temple themselves are considered by this? The reason I told the story here, because we don't know what stores looked like up in the Temple Mount. It's not accessible for us to excavate for obvious political reasons. And some scholars are convinced that when the reference is made, it also includes the area surrounding the Temple Mount itself. So the point itself is correct, and thank you for addressing this, but this is because we're not certain as to where. Most scholars I heard said this is also a fine location for this story.
Thank you. And then when people went into the mikvah, somebody asked what happened to their sacrificial animal at that time, right? They had already purchased them. So technically, what happened?
It's a great question. It's a question that gets asked every time. And the answer is we don't have a definite writing. So I can't tell you like, this is exactly what they did. Can assume they gave the animal to be held by a neighbor that has already been immersed in the water, or they tied the animal with a rope, if it's a goat, a lamb, to the ground, went, dipped in, and then carried on in their way. I don't have a definite answer. We just have to use, I think, our common sense for this purpose.
All right. And then can you go back to the picture of the stairs? Somebody had a question related
Sure.
to that picture of the modern day, not of the mikvah, of the right. So where were the openings there to enter the Temple Mount? Because right now they all look closed.
Yeah, so over here we have the exits that are also sealed off. The openings you can't see because, and this is one of the classic things you see in Jerusalem, that Jerusalem is like a mosaic with different buildings, different layers built at different eras, right? So over here you see a wall that was built later, and this wall is actually blocking off the historical entranceway, one of the two entrance gates, and you can only see the corner over here. You see just the top corner in the darker color.
Mm-hmm.
This is all we have left of the entrance. And to answer your next follow-up question, who blocked it when, and can it be unblocked? So can't be unblocked today because of the political sensitivity. Most likely it was blocked somewhere around 1,000 years ago. Some scholars even place it earlier to the early 7th century by the Muslims. Others actually place the blame on the Crusaders, so roughly around the 11th, 12th century. So in either one of these time periods, these entrances were blocked, and today you can't enter the Temple Mount from those entrances.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm sure you get this question often, but women and children were allowed to go up until what point?
So women and children were only allowed to enter the temple up until the women's court. If I can zoom out over here and actually use this over here and give you a slight better view. So over here, if it will load quickly enough, a little bit of, here we go. So over here, this is the area of the women's court, and this is as far as the woman could go. And here, this, we're, okay, we're getting a little lost here.
Technology is amazing.
The technology is amazing, but this is as far as women and children could go. Later on, you had the area Ezrat Israel that only men could go. Later on, you had the area that only the Kohanim and the Leviim could go. And in the Holy of Holies, you had only the area where the Kohen Gadol could go. So
And
it was...
Go ahead, sorry.
No, so it was regulated.
And I assume that there were separate mikvot for men and women.
Actually, no.
No. Wow.
We're not at least we could find. And the assumption is that there were separate hours for men and women. We didn't find a mikveh specifically for men and women. However, at that historical time frame, men and women both used the mikveh.
That's very interesting. And not an answer you would expect. So somebody asked, why do the Muslims believe that Muhammad went up to the heaven right where the temple was?
So it's a more sensitive question, and According to Muslim tradition, first of all, there's nothing by accident. Don't forget that when Muhammad established Islam, he lived amongst Jews. Some scholars actually believe that he learned how to read and write from Christians and Jews who lived in the Arab Peninsula. And this is how we find Jewish and Christian stories embraced in the Quran, sometimes with a different twist. For example, instead of the binding of Isaac, we have the binding of Ishmael. But Muhammad actually, to try and create a religion, like an umbrella religion that would also include the Jewish population. As a result of that, for a period of time, I believe 12 years, Muslims actually prayed like Jews towards Jerusalem and not towards Mecca. Now, therefore, when the Quran is written, then we can understand how stories from Judaism and sites that are important to Jews find themselves as part of the Quran. So why from that specific place? This specific place is not marked or mentioned in the Quran. It actually says Al-Aqsa, which translates to the edge. It doesn't say specifically Jerusalem, but the tradition later on connected the site to Jerusalem. And when I say later on, roughly 20 years after the passing away of Muhammad. The first Muslim building that was built on the Temple Mount was built in the year 691. Okay, so just to give us a little bit of a historical context, the Jewish temple was destroyed, the second temple, in the year 70. 621 years later, this is the first time that a Muslim structure is built on top of it, which means the tradition had to come from around that time frame. So around the year 650, etc. In the Quran, it doesn't say Jerusalem black and white. So it's a traditional that has become a religious belief.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question. Why is the Western Wall so popular to tourists and for people outside? And why is the Southern Wall not really so well known?
So it's a great question. In order to give just a little bit of a briefer history, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. People think it's out of context what I'm saying, but it has a context. But the Jews are expelled from Spain too. The Jews in Spain, as we all know, were the backbone of the local economy. They were merchants, they were doctors, they were lawyers, and there were a lot of kings at that given time that wanted to attract this Jewish population. And the Ottoman Sultan approached the Jewish community and said, I'm going to give you something that the Jews did not have in 1500 years. And if I was there in the room, and it was, but I can imagine they were like, oh my God, you're going to let us rebuild the temple? And he's like, whoa. Hold your horses, guys, relax. Can't let you rebuild the temple. It's the third holiest site for the Muslim world there. Tell you what I can do for you. I will give you a site of worship as close as it can be to where your temple once stood. So now you're asking me, all right, great. So where is that going to be? The only piece of them retaining wall that was built by King Herod that is not covered with buildings and is within the boundaries of the walls of the old city. Okay, everything I said was a little complicated, better seen than explained. Let's go to the place itself. Okay, so first of all, over here you can see a zoomed out version. You can see the Golden Dome, right? You can see where we did our tour today. So most of our tour was around this corner. You can see the steps where my mouse is over here. These are the southern steps. And over here we have the Western Wall. Now, if you look at the Western Wall, and I'm going to use another visual aid over here to make things a little easier to understand, you can see that the Western Wall is really long, like really long, like 482 meters long. Today, we only use 20% of it. Now, you're probably asking, why do we only use 20% of the Western Wall? Because this was the only part of the Western Wall that was exposed 500 years ago. Do you see this example of this building? This building over here blocks the continuation of the Western Wall. This Western Wall continues way further west over there, but you have other buildings that are blocking it. So this was given to the Jewish population out of convenience because it was the only wall within the city that was exposed, did not have any buildings leaning on top of it, and it was the original retaining wall of the Temple Mount built by King Herod. Later on, Jewish historical connections were tied to this Western Wall. One of the most famous ones, Shechina eina zaza min hakotel ha'ma'aravi. Shechina, godly presence, has never left the Western Wall. What we don't hear is that they don't mean the Western retaining wall. They mean the physical Western wall of the temple that is no longer there. So it was a combination of what was available at the time in terms of the closest site, and later on, more religious context was put into it. And over time, over the course of the last 500 years, it has become the emblem or logo of Jewish worship in Jerusalem, although at the time of the temple itself, this was just a retaining wall. It's not the wall of the temple. The temple is located above it. Does this make sense, Liz?
Yes. So so the southern wall that we were just looking at before, was that excavated afterwards, or was that there?
It was excavated afterwards, but it was also outside the walls of the old city.
Right, right.
Because yeah, go ahead.
And then are they still digging there now? Are they finding new things, or is it complete, the excavation?
So just to demonstrate what I said earlier, this is outside the walls of the old city.
Right.
They're standing outside, and therefore this did not become the site of worship. Today, I think there's very limited excavation happening here. Most of the excavations, the exciting ones, are actually happening right now in the city of David. What you see over here, this is the Pilgrims Road that was recently discovered, and it's a continuation of the Southern Steps. At the bottom, you see the pool of Siloam, which was a massive mikveh, all right, a massive one. And pilgrims walked on stairs all the way from the pool of Siloam, all the way to the Southern Steps where we were today. And over here, you can see this was now excavated, which means when I took this photo, I was probably amongst the first 500 people to walk here after 2,000 years. And those are the original stones that pilgrims walked on in Sukkot as well.
Wonderful. And so we have 2 more minutes. I'm just going to end with one final question. So who visits this area today? Is it mostly a Jewish population? Are people of other religions coming to view this area?
Great question. Evangelical Christians, it's a must for them. There isn't one evangelical Christian group that would not visit it. Jewish groups, I would say 70% of the Jewish groups I guide visit the site. A lot of the remaining 30% would either just stick to the Western Wall because that's what they're familiar with, that's what's in their program, or they would replace the Southern Wall excavations with the Western Wall tunnels, for instance. Myself, I'm a diehard fan of the Southern Wall excavations. I would prefer it over the Western Wall, but that's just me. So this is like the main demography of the groups that visit it. Also, you have people that don't have a religious affiliation, but the main are either Jewish groups or evangelical Christians.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this incredibly fascinating lecture. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say thank you for sharing your knowledge and passion with us and allowing us to visit Israel from afar. I know so many people present here today wishes that they could be in Israel, especially for the holiday of Sukkot, and we feel like we are there even virtually. So we look forward to visiting it soon in the near future in person.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this evening's session. As someone who has an intimate knowledge and connection to Jerusalem and has toured there often, I found Assaf's presentation absolutely fantastic. And in absentia, I'd just like to thank him on my behalf, on your behalf, for his gripping and insightful presentation. Before we end off, I hope that you enjoyed it all. I'd like to thank you for attending. And I just want to mention our next event, which will be on the 14th of October, where we will have the pleasure of attending the launch of Francis Prince's new book. This is an event organized by the Jewish Holocaust Center. Frances is one of the founders of March of the Living Australia, and she accompanied the March of the Living 3 times as an educator. Her father, David, came with as well, and it gives me great pleasure to recommend that you join this event on the 14th. If you register on the JHC's website, you'll be able to join that. We'll also publicize it on our social media, etc., etc., etc. So that's coming up. So thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening and see you next time.